Man, the world can just not stop being interesting now, can it? Recently, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro made a very interesting comment at the International Anti-Fascist Festival hosted in Caracas. As attendants walked around the aisles of the events waving the flags of their home countries, Maduro would notice some Puerto Rican flags and pointed at those holding them, saying, "Just as the North has an agenda of colonization, we have an agenda of liberation." He then continued saying that this agenda of liberation was given to them by Simón Bolívar, and that he said that Brazilian troops were going to help them liberate Puerto Rico, like from the United States. Now, mind you, my friends, when I talk about this whole thing, this happened several weeks ago, and of course, nothing has really happened since then because it is Venezuela threatening the United States, which would go about as well as you can probably imagine. But with the sheer amount of things that I've had to do here for the past several weeks, there has been no ability until now for me to really cover this. But I had to cover it because the sheer audacity of it is just laughable. It's something that really blows the mind, and it then brings up an interesting question. Why does the United States even have control of Puerto Rico? And if it isn't a state, then what is it? And why should the Americans even care about what actually happens to a Caribbean island 1,000 miles away or more from them? Also, I really have to ask this at this point, but did anyone go and inform the Brazilians that, hey, they're scheduled to be liberating anyone in the near future? Like, what was even the point of that? Well, my friends, that is exactly what we're going to be answering here in today's video. Well, speaking of terrible events and injuries, oh dear God, is this a segue? This video, in the most ironic way possible, is sponsored by Morgan & Morgan. Yes, the law firm. And you actually do not understand how ironic this is. You see, my friends, just a couple days ago, I was in an accident, and this is my car. When we stopped at a red light, a pickup truck that was behind us failed to stop because apparently the person got a piece of blender stuck underneath their brake, which, no, I'm not kidding about that, and then proceeded to ram us from behind at full speed. Now, luckily, at the time of the accident, there was no severe injury, but since then, there has been some consistent, lasting bodily pains. Depending on how all of this goes for me, Morgan & Morgan could be seriously useful right now. Because look, when you're seriously hurt, your injury could actually be worth millions. Because look, Morgan & Morgan doesn't settle for lowball offers. They've achieved significant verdicts in the past couple of months for victims involved in life-altering car crashes, with one $12 million case in Florida and another $26 million case in Philadelphia. What's awesome is that the fee is absolutely free unless it is that you win. So look, if you ever got seriously injured, your case, as I said, could be worth millions. Unless you could be only a few clicks away from actually changing your life. If any of this is relevant to you, you can go and click my link down in the description below and go to www.forthepeople.com/historyofelverything. To explore the context of the story of Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States is something that begins in 1898. This being when the Americans were coming into their own at the time as a world superpower, but not the world superpower. Still, that being said, no one had really seen them in battle yet with their new warships or developed military. They had only seen them really fight themselves with the American Civil War that had been 30 years prior. Meanwhile, the Spanish Empire was still, technically speaking, in the Americas, but they were practically hemorrhaging colonies during the 19th century. It started after the Napoleonic Wars, which led to the Peninsular War from 1807 to 1814, and during that time, nearly all of Spain's colonies in the New World would achieve their independence within a 30-year period, mostly because Spain was simply too busy fighting at home to send too many troops halfway around the world to keep revolutions from popping up. So, men like Simón Bolívar, as Maduro would go and mention, knew this, and he took advantage of the situation. By the time the year 1898 rolled around, the only major colonies Spain had left were Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Everything else was gone. If you'd actually like us to do an episode about the fall of the Spanish Empire, let us know in the comments. That sounds like a fun one. Anyway, so when America went and invaded Cuba and Puerto Rico in the summer of 1898, they did it as part of a wave of nationalist fervor known as jingoism. And this is something that you'd see with many different entities throughout the 19th century. Now, jingoism can also be described as belligerent nationalism, or the belief in the rightness and virtue of one's own nation or group simply because it's theirs, like it's your own at that point. Jingoism is something that entails an aggressive foreign policy, including the use of threats and use of, well, actual force besides just threats, to obtain one's goals, as opposed to a policy that reflects negotiating with other countries. Basically, if you want to imagine this as anything in the modern day and age, think of North Korea. Like, the North Koreans professing the infallibility of their own country while their people starve, and you're kind of halfway there. Except, in this case, the force can actually be backed up. Now, of course, this is 1898 we're talking about, so the trend in the late 1890s of jingoistic fervor was seen by many as America simply asserting itself and its position on the world stage as a rising power. This is the thing that was simply done at the time, just as it was done by just about any nation in history. In other words, back then, it wasn't necessarily well received by everyone. They didn't like it when conflict came to their doorstep, but it was way less controversial back then in comparison to, say, well, someone today wanting to take over a territory. The United Nations didn't exist yet, and even the League of Nations was still almost 20 years away from being espoused by Woodrow Wilson, so you kind of had to deal with what it is you had. Now, arguably, if you want to bring up any humanitarian reasons or anything along those lines, what the Americans really should have been invading Cuba for were the creation of concentration camps by the absolutely brutal and sadistic governor of Cuba, Valeriano Weyler, nicknamed the Butcher. Now, many of the photos of the survivors of these camps look like they came straight out of Auschwitz. It's a whole other thing entirely. It's a sad bit of history that basically no one talks about. Either way, the United States would smack the Spanish into submission quite easily and obtain Cuba as well as Puerto Rico. Now, Cuba had been attempting to attain independence since 1895, so when they signed the 1898 Treaty of Paris with Spain, the Americans set Cuba up to become an independent state by 1902. But they decided to keep a hold of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Of course, the Philippines would immediately push for independence, starting the Philippine-American War, which, again, honestly deserves its own podcast episode, and the Philippines would fully break ties with the US in 1946 through the Treaty of Manila. Guam and Puerto Rico would not be so lucky in that sense. The first 20 years of American rule over Puerto Rico was mostly marked with trying to gain greater civil rights from the United States. Eventually, the Jones Act of 1917 was passed, which made Puerto Ricans U.S. citizen by birthright, and the times between the world wars were difficult, and the island was mostly neglected by the American government. Not really much was done. As just an example, journalist John Gunther would describe the island in 1941 as such. Quote, "I saw, in short, misery, disease, squalor, filth. It would be lamentable enough to see this anywhere. To see it on American territory is a paralyzing jolt to anyone who believes in American standards of progress and civilization." End quote. Now this, my friends, is something that paved the way for the drafting of Puerto Rico's constitution and its approval by Puerto Rican voters and Congress in 1952. So it is then, much of Puerto Rican culture today looks back on the post-war period of the 1940s leading all the way to the 1980s as the golden era for Puerto Rico. This is the time in which the island, its government, and the United States government actually worked together to pull the colony out of its old world agricultural roots into an industrial and manufacturing boom for the island. The United States would call it Operation Bootstrap, which, yeah, no, if you're actually curious about that with the whole thing, like think of the idea of pulling oneself up by your bootstraps. This plan was loosely based on the New Deal and entailed building factories to employ the locals as well as changes to entice investment from the US mainland. Of course, that was going to require a lot of work. To change an economy based primarily on sugarcane plantations, which used to employ a quarter of the population, mind you, the US government in Puerto Rico enticed US companies by providing labor at costs below those on the mainland, as well as access to US markets without import duties and profits that could transfer to the mainland free from federal taxation. That's kind of a big deal. The Administration of Economic Development invited investment of external capital, importing the raw materials and exporting the finished products to the mainland. To entice participation, tax exemptions and differential rental rates were offered for industrial facilities. As a result, Puerto Rico's economy would rapidly shift labor from agriculture to manufacturing and tourism. Through this project, a rural agricultural society was transformed into an industrial working class. Initially, the factories were mostly manufactured things like food, tobacco, leather, and apparel. But over time, they actually switched to significantly more developed products: pharmaceuticals, chemicals, machinery, and electronics. If you want to describe this as anything, Project Bootstrap was essentially the Puerto Rican economic miracle. It started out as a resounding success, and it helped Luis Munoz Marin to gain enough fame and support to become Puerto Rico's first governor. He then spread Operation Bootstrap efforts across the whole island. In the 1950s, education was something that was viewed as a cornerstone of the island's development and was allocated more of the island's budget than any other public sector. From 1932 to 1957, the number of students enrolled in vocational education went from 5,700 to 110,000. New electric grids were built, new roads were paved in major cities, and major housing development was underway. As a result, life expectancy in Puerto Rico would jump in this time period by around 23 years, which is a lot. Of course, not everything that is good is going to last, and by the late 1960s, cracks and flaws in the system began to show. Living standards and wages had grown for Puerto Ricans, and the island's manpower-intensive industries began to get undercut by foreign countries that could offer workers who would put up with far lower wages. The average real weekly salary in manufacturing increased from $18 for men and $12 for women in 1953 to $44 and $37 respectively in 1963, which is a very big jump. Oddly enough, that is actually something that had been accounted for in the planning of Operation Bootstrap. One of its 3 core tenets was that in order to ensure the plan's success, emigration of over a third of the island's population would need to happen. That all being said, they didn't really think that switching everyone from an agrarian economy into manufacturing would be possible. The only other way to ensure success then was if they could somehow make the Puerto Rican people just have less kids. And so they kind of did. Yes, my friends, in one of the most shameful corners of American history resides the fact that for over 20 years, from the late 1940s to the 1960s, programs funded by the United States government strongly encouraged sterilization for women on the island. Now, why was this, you may wonder? Well, it was partly based on eugenics, which is mostly based on racism. Never mind that plenty of American families had 4 or more children. It became the American government's view that the average-sized Puerto Rican family with 5 or 6 family members was not sustainable in the modern era, so massive resources were used to incite doctors into lowering the birth rate. The government knew that most of the people, especially the poorest, looked up to doctors as some of the most educated and most trustworthy people on the whole island, and this was a time when getting a second opinion wasn't really a thing. You went to the doctor that you had, and they told you what you needed to do or what needed to happen to ensure the health of you and your family. And so this effort to curb the birth rate proved devastatingly effective exactly because most Puerto Ricans at the time blindly trusted their doctor to be honest and straightforward with them, which when you look at medicine and history, it's not necessarily something that is very clean. The whole scandal involved doctors placing intense pressure on women to have hysterectomies done when in reality, they didn't need them most of the time. Sterilization was so common that it became simply known as la operación, like the operation, among Puerto Ricans. Because of this, more than a third of all Puerto Rican women were coerced into sterilization during this time. Like honestly, this is one of those things that's just going to sound absolutely insane with history and really just does need to be its own podcast episode. And that is actually why, on this note, my wife, Gabby, she is doing her own episode dedicated specifically to this and the history of birth control within the United States and how the whole thing was developed. Because this is truly wild. Because of this, more than a third of all Puerto Rican women were coerced into sterilization during this time. More than a third. It stands up next to other shameful moments in our history, like California's asexualization acts in the 1910s and 20s, which is something that led to the sterilization of 20,000 disproportionately Black and Mexican people who were deemed to be mentally ill. Or how, as another example, you had non-consensual sterilizations of working-class Black women in the Deep South states, where this was something that was so common in the 1960s that they were colloquially known as a Mississippi appendectomy. Or how about, as just another example, the Indian Health Service, which was accused of sterilizing nearly 25% of indigenous women during the 1960s and 70s. Okay, now at this point, I'm going a little bit off. This is one of those points where I actually talk about things in history, and I get kind of annoyed because, as I'm sure a number of you are probably aware, I get called a lot of things here on the internet. I see the comments all the time that ask me, oh, so you're going to talk about this, but you're not going to talk about the stuff that happens in the United States, you hypocrite. And it's like, no, absolutely not. I will talk about quite literally everything. I have said this before and will say it again. There is no country on this planet that does not have skeletons of some form in their closet. And I will talk about everything. If you want to hear about government attempts to sterilize our own population, then let me know in the comment section below. I'm sure that this could be a whole messy deep dive at some point here in the future. Long story short, and if you want the long version, definitely go and check out my wife's episode, this push from the government was so effective that many families simply died out. As in, none of the siblings could have kids anymore, so a whole family simply ended once that generation died out. This was something that, as you can imagine, would be very upsetting. Moving on from that, one of the other central pillars of Operation Bootstrap was that tax breaks were given for manufacturers that would jumpstart local economies because it was believed that they would need local suppliers. But in reality, the manufacturers were still tied to global supply chains, and no matter how cheap Puerto Ricans could manufacture things, they just really couldn't compete with the cost of raw goods and resources that were needed to actually build those things in the first place. Like, just let me give you this as a prime example. If you went and started a t-shirt factory in Puerto Rico during this time, you could make the t-shirts with extremely cheap labor, but you still needed to get the cotton that was necessary to make those shirts in the first place, and that could be sourced for way cheaper from other places. Eventually, places like Bangladesh would even undercut the labor costs as the textile industry's infrastructure was built and they assumed a larger portion of the global textile industry at that time. This happened in nearly every type of industry they tried to get going in Puerto Rico. It just would go kind of well initially and then eventually get undercut. Still though, between 1950 and 1980, per capita gross national product would grow tenfold in Puerto Rico, and disposable income shot up 1,600%. So there was quite a number of positivities according to the Puerto Rican Planning Board. Yet, during that same period, unemployment would rise, and labor participation rates would fall. Most notably, tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans would move away, with 600,000 more people leaving than arriving between 1950 and 1970. And that is part of what makes the Puerto Rican economy unique. It's poorer than the poorest U.S. state, Mississippi, with 41% of the population living below the poverty line. Yet, still, that being said, it simultaneously has the highest GDP per capita in all of Latin America. So there is a strength there. Anyway, in a similar vein, we're going to need to mention something here about taxes. Also known as the possession tax credit, Section 936 was a provision in our tax code enacted in 1976, ostensibly to encourage business investment in Puerto Rico. Section 936 worked by exempting profits earned by U.S. companies in Puerto Rico from federal income tax. Of course, this is something that many people, or I should say companies want to abuse, and so corporations were very quick to set up subsidiaries in Puerto Rico, and massive tax dodging and profit shifting soon followed. Over the 30-year lifespan of Section 936, companies would manage to shift billions of dollars in corporate income to their Puerto Rican subsidiaries in order to receive partial or even full exemption from federal taxes. In the 1980s, corporations had an estimated total of $8.5 billion in tax savings, and in 1987 alone, those profit-shifting activities are estimated to have cost the Treasury Department $2.33 billion in revenue. In 1998, during the phase-out period of the credit and when corporations were significantly disinvesting in Puerto Rico, 6 companies had a total of $912 million in tax breaks thanks to Section 936. The thing is, even while the credit reduced corporate tax bills, Puerto Ricans did not see a proportional benefit. In fact, Puerto Rico would soon find itself stuck with the finance curse, which is something that occurs when a nation's political and economic institutions are increasingly oriented and co-opted by wealthy international elites to the detriment of its own people. This is something that is evidenced by the discrepancies between corporate investment in Puerto Rico and the development of the island. Despite the economic growth, Puerto Rican per capita income remained less than 30% of the US average, and local unemployment remained more than double the mainland's rate. Meanwhile, the firms located on the island enjoyed massively large profits and low tax bills. Pharmaceutical companies, by far the biggest beneficiaries of Section 936, enjoyed a $70,788 tax break per employee on the island in 1987. In general, when faced with the decision to make investments that maximized profits or promoted Puerto Rican development, firms would overwhelmingly choose to pursue the former, eventually convincing U.S. Congress that the costs of Section 936 greatly outweighed its benefits. Of course, the companies didn't like that, but Congress, looking at the situation, kind of realized, okay, hey, this is something that seems to be very abusable. The possibility that Puerto Rico would suffer greatly from the finance curse was inherent from its very beginning as a commonwealth. In 1952, Puerto Rico's constitution was ratified. It included a severely short-sighted provision at that time, that being Section 8 of Article 6, that requires that Puerto Rican government must make payments to reduce its public debt before paying any other expenses, including the funding of even basic public services. From the start, economic institutions were working against the people of Puerto Rico. Now, that all being said, there are much better policy solutions to Puerto Rico's debt crisis that would create sustainable growth. One option, as just an example, would be for the US to expand the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC, to include Puerto Rico, which it currently does not, actually. Expanding the EITC in this way could encourage low-income and out-of-work Puerto Ricans to enter the labor force and actually help Puerto Rican businesses through higher demand for their products and services. But that's not the case, and the effects of this were very clearly seen once any kind of tax breaks were gone. You see, in the 1990s, the tax breaks were removed, and by 2006, Puerto Rico was in the midst of a recession. This directly coincided with the ending of the tax breaks. The island simply had no replacement in line to compensate for losing a massive chunk of its economy, as corporations would pull up left and right by the dozens. But hey, wait, just like my shirts, remember, it gets worse. The following year, the worldwide global recession would hit, and the people of Puerto Rico began to suffer even more. This would even out around 2012 when they experienced 4 straight quarters of economic growth, which was nice, only to then be thrown into recession again in 2013. This is something that was compounded by poor local government management that was likely made worse by the constant brain drain of the most talented Puerto Ricans, leaving the island in droves for higher wages and more opportunity in the US. Remember, if you were Puerto Rican, you were automatically a US citizen. So if you wanted to go and just work in the United States, you could. So the best and brightest of the area would move away, leaving behind those that simply could not pick up the slack. The tax situation is thus similarly uneven. Puerto Ricans don't pay federal income tax, except if they are federal employees, military, or have US-based income. But since the threshold for paying income tax is lower on the island, and since the Puerto Rican tax rate is higher than the average state and local tax rate, Puerto Ricans don't end up paying less in income tax, according to a Government Accountability Office report. Taxes and utility bills would shoot up after this, foreclosures would skyrocket, and the island's unemployment rate would hit 12% in the year 2016. Another reason that this would occur was because, due to tax breaks for corporations, the American government had essentially created an island of employees instead of an island of entrepreneurs. When the large employers left, so did many of the employees. This is indicated quite sharply by the fact that in 2015, only 2.3% of the island's population were self-employed, which is a rate that is lower than all but 2 US states. Pretty much all the entrepreneurs had left the island to start businesses in the US, which can be seen again by the fact that in the same year, 2015, Puerto Rican businessmen in the rest of the United States shot up by 65%. This was larger, mind you, than any other Latin American or Hispanic group, according to the US Census data. The numbers kind of speak for themselves. The University of Puerto Rico, with 11 campuses and some 70,000 students, would go and produce some of Puerto Rico's most influential minds, including 4 of its ex-governors. UPR's engineering school especially has a strong reputation. But Yvette Collazo, the director of the U.S. Small Business Administration's Puerto Rico branch, would recall that during her years as a UPR student in the early 1990s, quote, "Nobody ever talked to me about opening my own business." This is something that is made even more difficult by the complicated bureaucracy of Puerto Rico's government, which is something that requires multiple permits and certificates. That means that sometimes over 20 different forms have to be filled out in order to get business permits, including at least 5 certificates of tax compliance alone. In what is probably one of the most ridiculous examples that I've ever heard of bloated bureaucracy, an ice cream truck vendor had to submit 23 separate documents for a 1-year operating permit in the island's capital of San Juan. In this particular story referring to the driver, she considered only working festivals and concerts, which is something that actually happens all the time in Puerto Rico, but then she found out that those vendors who only work temporarily at festivals and concerts still have to submit the same 23 documents, even though it could be just like a one-day event. That's it. Another problem attributed to the bloated bureaucracy was the pensions and retirement benefits for public employees that far outgrew the island's ability to actually pay them. Reform efforts did go into place in 2013, and the effect was disastrous. Suddenly, people about to retire were told that they were going to have to work several more years for reduced benefits overnight. This is something that only contributed to the island's debt, which grew tremendously in the early 2000s and 2010s. By the time 2016 rolled around, with that ridiculously high unemployment rate, the island also faced a $70 billion debt that it simply could not repay. Mind you, we are talking about a small island here that is poorer than any US state, and it still has a $70 billion debt. That same year, it would default on its first loan repayment. Obviously, the situation that Puerto Rico faces is not great. Many of the problems that it has to deal with are caused by its Commonwealth status, which is pretty much just a fancy way of calling it a territory. And for years, the greatest political debate and the cornerstone of Puerto Rican political divisions has been the question of statehood or independence. For Puerto Rico, it is something that is in a kind of halfway state. It is something that can receive some benefits, but simultaneously get screwed over in a position that is not easy to recover from. In Puerto Rico, teachers as well as police officers are ineligible for Social Security, so pension payments are often all they have for retirement. So that pension crisis that I just explained, that could have been helped if Puerto Rico was a state because its employees would then qualify for Social Security and Medicare. That becomes an even bigger solution when it comes to those with disabilities. Currently, because it's not a state, Puerto Ricans don't have access to even a fraction of the public services offered to even the poorest Americans, things such as SNAP or WIC. Now, that all being said, they do have their own version of some of these services, but they are grossly underfunded and don't receive any federal funding. In other words, the island is left to pretty much fend for itself, to pay for the same services that every state qualifies for. As the island's brain drain continued, most of the better doctors, better engineers, better anyone would leave for the states, and the island would then suffer from a lack of adequate healthcare providers due to this. As one could probably imagine, the situation for those that actually need these services means that it gets pretty rough. Disabled citizens across Puerto Rico get almost no help from either the local or the US government. For 40 years, Congress has repeatedly refused to give the impoverished island, which, again, is a U.S. territory, the same support that it provides disabled Americans in the 50 states under the Federal Supplemental Security Income Program. This, at this point, being referred to as we go forward as SSI, so I don't have to say that over and over again. Payroll taxes are also another big sore point with Puerto Ricans. They must pay the same FICA taxes as workers on the mainland, but are not eligible for SSI, which provides extra help to the aged, blind, or disabled people with very low incomes. So they pay into SSI, but they can't actually use its benefits. Interestingly enough, this is actually something that came to a head in 2022, only a few short years ago, when the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Puerto Rico and other U.S. territories do not actually have a constitutional right to federal assistance programs such as SSI. And that, my friends, is not the only one. This is something that leads us to another place where the US government has sorely let down the Puerto Ricans, arguably: disaster relief. In case you weren't aware, Puerto Rico is susceptible to being struck by hurricanes, being down there in the Caribbean, and every time it is hit by a particularly bad hurricane, the island and its people suffer immensely and look towards the mainland for assistance. No storm was a better example of this than Hurricane Maria, which struck Puerto Rico back in 2017. As just an example of how it is that this went, so you understand the scope of what I'm talking about here. Two top officials with the Development of Housing and Urban Development would admit at a congressional hearing in 2021 that the agency knowingly missed a legally required deadline that would have made desperately needed hurricane relief funding available to Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Maria. The housing agency was supposed to issue state funding notices to 18 states affected by the disaster on September 4th. They published all notices except Puerto Rico's. The publication of the notice would have allowed Puerto Rico to start drafting a plan that would create the structures needed to manage the much-needed funds, and 2 years later, Puerto Rico would still only have received a third of the promised hurricane relief funds allocated by Congress. In fact, my podcast editor, James, is just an example. He is actually of Puerto Rican descent, and he traveled to the island back in 2015 to visit his family. And even a year after the hurricane, there were still people waiting to receive funds for a new roof for their house and using blue tarps as makeshift roofs. It's just, that is the standard of what happened. Parts of the island were still without electricity and running water for up to 6 months after the storm. There were still plenty parts of the island that suffered from inconsistent power a year later. This storm would kill over 3,000 Puerto Ricans and knock out power to the entire island. The Puerto Rican government, as well as the Trump administration, claimed that only 64 people died, but numerous news organizations and government inquiries would state that the loss of life was no less than 2,975. A Harvard study would even put the numbers higher. To add to the difficulties in that time, Puerto Rico's power grids have not been updated since the 1950s and 60s, so it took them an immensely long time to repair the grid and get power back to the island. It is something that took so long that it was the world's second longest blackout ever. And this happened to people that were American citizens, mind you. The situation was so bad for the island's residents that 8% of the entire population left the island due to the terrible living conditions. And for an island that makes a huge chunk of its GDP from tourism, that is absolutely devastating. And honestly, my friends, one of the things that is insane, despite every single thing that I have said here or explained over the course of this video, and all the different problems that the island faces, the people of it still serve and take pride in themselves, not just as Puerto Rican, but many of them specifically want to be American. They are already citizens, but they want to be more than that. At the end, though, here is the fairly ugly part. Puerto Ricans, despite all of this, have no voting representative in Washington. They have a residential commissioner who is basically a member of Congress who can advise and report to Congress, yet at the same time has no actual vote or influence that comes from having a vote. They have the right to vote in presidential primaries, yet are not actually allowed to vote in an actual presidential election. It is not my place to make an argument on this channel, and that is not something that I plan on doing, but I will point out what seems like a very obvious statement here. This seems dangerously close to taxation without representation, since Puerto Ricans do in fact pay certain taxes along with every American citizen, and if you recall, that's kind of the whole reason that we even fought a revolutionary war in the first place. For many in Puerto Rico, the frustration is feeling like a second-class citizen that has been legalized to be treated that way. So, for most of the Puerto Ricans, the answer is statehood. Now, there is always a certain portion of the population who vote for independence or free association, which is a mixture of independence and their current status with the US. But in reality, in 2012, 2017, and 2020, Puerto Ricans voted in a majority for statehood every single time. And in case those votes weren't recent enough, they actually just held another vote this last November of 2024, and again, the majority voted for statehood. In addition to that, they would also elect Jennifer Gonzalez Colon as governor of Puerto Rico, who was the leading candidate supporting statehood and a prior presidential commissioner. Now, one of her first acts as governor was to request aid from the United States, as Puerto Ricans suffered a week-long blackout in some places that started on Christmas Day, so it wasn't a fun time. But also, amongst those actions that she took in her first month of her term was to ask President Trump to firmly take action against the comments being made by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, saying, and I quote, "I trust your incoming administration will swiftly respond and make clear to the Maduro regime that under your leadership, the United States will protect American lives and sovereignty and will not bow down to the threats of petty, murderous dictators," she would write. Which is something I honestly find hilarious because it sounds like an angry mother. So then, my friends, in the end, it does bring up the question of why hasn't Puerto Rico become a state yet? Well, for a long time, the answer was simple: racism. And when I'm saying that, I'm not saying it from a modern sociological perspective or anything along those lines. I mean that genuinely throughout history. Puerto Ricans were thought of to be a lesser class of people 100 years ago by many American politicians, and there was no real reason to bring them in as a state because of this. In recent decades, one could then argue that it is because, the island tended to vote Democratic, which would cause statehood to become an issue that got politicized along party lines. Perhaps. Yet, at the same time, this too could be passing in relevance. In the 2024 election, Donald Trump won the support of many Puerto Rican communities in Florida and Pennsylvania, allowing him to win those states, and even Reince Priebus, a former Republican National Committee chairman, would say, quote, "This idea that Puerto Rico is just a bunch of Democrats is totally false," end quote. Now, many politicians had previously said no to the idea of Puerto Rico becoming a state because of the District of Columbia wanting statehood as well. But they're really two separate issues entirely. Puerto Rico can attain statehood by a simple act of Congress, whereas the District of Columbia would require an amendment to be passed for it to attain statehood. Ultimately, in the end, the people of Puerto Rico have repeatedly decided what it is that they want. Even if some people do not, the majority do. They want equal treatment, equal representation, under the law, as citizens, and with the island as a state of the United States. Whether or not that is actually going to change, we don't really have a way to confirm. As for Maduro and his comments, well, those things likely weren't serious, and were probably just more political posturing, which is something that he is extremely famous for, as unlike what we have seen of recent actions of certain politicians who actually back up their words, with very interesting global effects, Maduro can't really do anything. Now, when I say that, just in case he was serious, it's a much worse offense to attack an American state than a US territory. Technically speaking, Puerto Rico could play a key role in guarding the Caribbean and our southern coastal borders against any foreign aggressors. They've been fighting for us for over 100 years already, but it remains to be seen how exactly the incoming Trump administration will treat Puerto Rico. Depending upon how that goes, well, who knows where we will be in 4 years' time. With that, my friends, we are going to leave things here today. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you all here next time. Let me know in the comment section below if there's anything that you would like for us to see next, or dive into, or explain. I appreciate all of your feedback and input. Thank you, my friends, and goodbye.